Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence. So today we're going to talk about why technology risks are logistics risks, how a single data point could save millions. So let's get a little bit of housekeeping. So I gave this talk for a supply chain conference on May 7th. But I'm changing this presentation just a little bit because the target audience were logistics people and supply chain people. But the reality is, this is also going to apply to security practitioners as well, and also for CEOs. If you want to understand a little bit more how security and logistics can work together, this is one of those options. A little bit of information too. I did look at some articles. There was some conflicting information, but I did the best job I could to try to make sure that the information is reasonably accurate. All right. So the agenda here is we're going to take a step back in time. We'll take a step forward in time and take a look at the current supply chain. So let's dive in. So to set the stage a little bit, we're going to go back to the year 2017. So this was sort of interesting because news about the NSA hack related to Eternal Blue came out a year before. So Eternal Blue basically allowed Windows to be completely compromised. It's extremely serious. So patching and some of these other basic IT functions were incredibly important. So Microsoft had released a patch, and that was for a year earlier. So we're in 2017. They released it in 2016. So what happened was there was Petya for those who understand the background history, but then came NotPetya a little bit later. So it was a ransomware that stole credentials and was based upon Eternal Blue, but allows itself to quickly transmit across the organization. It was also targeted towards Ukraine. So the affected company in this particular case was Maersk. For those who don't know Maersk, they're an exceptionally large company that's dealing with shipping across the globe. They have 20% of the world shipping. Again, 20% of the world shipping is coming through Maersk. They had 574 offices across 130 countries and between 800 and 900 ships, depending on the source that I was reading from. And I saw anywhere from 200,000 computers was pretty common. I saw 100,000 employees, 1,000 warehouses, and roughly 4 million containers. So we're talking about a massive impact to an organization. It's really, really important because this is massive global information and deals with logistics on a very strong degree. They also had many old and or unpatchable systems in their organization. You can only imagine where this is going to be leading. So let's get into the event. So on June 27th, 2017, it was an early afternoon in San Francisco, and ransomware struck. In this case, NotPetya. So their key internal passwords were all stolen by NotPetya and being used to propagate throughout the organization. To give you an idea just how serious this is, they had roughly 55,000 endpoints were infected in 7 minutes. So remember I said there were roughly 200,000 systems in there, and more than a quarter of them were completely compromised in 7 minutes. That's massive. And it gives you an idea just how fast malware can act in an organization. I can tell you, and they know this probably better than many of you, it is very important to patch your systems. Within 2 hours, every single system shut down, and some of them were shut down to prevent damages. Couldn't find the exact numbers on the details there, but most employees were told to go home. A lot of them were worried, am I going to have a job in the morning? It's a big concern. But the reality is most of their infrastructure was affected. So this is a really big deal for a company that handles 20% of the world's shipping. Well, let's take a step back just for a second. For 2 weeks, the IT team was scrambling to get everything up and running. That's Herculean that they were able to do that. But they were able to get most of the systems up and running within those 2 weeks. That is fantastic. The response they had, I thought, was wonderful. Every single available domain controller was hit. So let me kind of paint a picture for those of you who are in the logistics world who don't understand what a domain controller is. I know my cybersecurity people probably know and are probably an expert at this, but it is a place that allows systems to be able to connect into one another. So it has things like your passwords can be put into a domain. It can be on a local system too. There's a whole bunch of architecture discussions that could go on there. But essentially, every single domain controller. This means that every single account was hit. And if the domain controller is down, you may have to create 200,000 accounts across all of these different systems. So this is part of the directory, which is part of a part of the domain controller. This is part of a larger topic known as an active directory. So let me paint some pictures there. So you've got, 200,000 systems, 100,000 employees. Now they probably have, and I don't know the exact numbers. It would be interesting to get that statistic, but I couldn't find it. But it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that there were 500,000 different accounts, because the reason why there are human accounts, but then there's accounts that are needed to connect into different applications or systems. And so there could be a tremendous number of accounts throughout the whole organization. Now, if you had to create an account for every single employee, imagine having to do that. That is a massive undertaking for any organization to start to build. Imagine that. Not only do you have to do that, you have to figure out what applications use what once you start to get things up and running and figure out, is this going to cause a problem or is it not going to cause a problem? So organizations were really dealing with the repercussions of this because a directory is such a big deal when you're talking about trying to get a system up and running. So imagine the IT teams are scrambling to get everything up and running, and then they also had to deal with potentially 500,000 accounts. This could be a massive undertaking that could have easily doubled the amount of time it would have taken them to get everything up and running. They didn't have a backup of that directory. So the other part of the basic impact here is terminals were down. No one knew what shipping container. So remember how I said there are 4 million containers that they had. Now imagine the people power it's going to take to walk over to each one of the 4 million containers. And here's the thing, they don't usually have a piece of paper saying, here's what's in each container. You have to open them up and take a look at it and try to figure things out. Imagine doing that on an Excel spreadsheet and you're carrying around a bunch of papers that are deep, full of possible shipping containers. This can be a big problem. Usually what they do is they'll have like a barcode or something, they'll scan it, get the information, report that information back. That's a big change. But let's go ahead and go a little bit further. When we're talking about New Jersey, the Maersk port was down. There were 18-wheelers that were backed up for miles and miles and miles. Some of them were trying to pick up, some were trying to drop off, some of them needed to go there to other locations in order to pick up new 18-wheelers. It's a really big deal for organizations. So this is a big challenge. What do you do in situations that are like this? And the reality is this was true across lots of other organizations. 17 ports across the globe were down in similar ways. You can imagine the impact across different parts of the industries. This isn't just one industry being hit. This is now affecting, because all these other trucks are affected, it's going to affect and reverberate for all these different truckers that are needing information or needing to pick up things or drop off things different places. This greatly affects the supply chain. This is a supply chain impact as a result of one company. A massive economic impact across the organizations and across the United States and beyond. But by all accounts, Maersk was dead in the water. They had to really get things up and running. But they had a lucky break. At the time of the incident, a key server, one of those domain controllers that I spoke about, was offline in Ghana due to a power outage. And they actually had a very low connectivity, so trying to get information over to Ghana in this particular case was definitely difficult. So what they had to do is they had to send a person out to Ghana to physically retrieve this directory, to be able to go pull that information. So I imagine they would have pulled off the connectivity to the rest of the network, turned on that domain controller once it was available, download that entire directory, and then bring it back. So this starts to paint a picture for you what's actually going on and how important this directory is. If they had it backed up in the backup systems and the backup systems were disconnected, that would be a completely different story if they had it backed up. But since they didn't have it backed up, they needed to send somebody out there to the available domain controller to collect that information. That said, given everything that took place, The damage to Maersk was roughly 350 million. It's definitely a big concern. While it took them 2 weeks to get basic function up and running, it took them months to fully recover from such an incident like that. But we're going to play a little game here of what if. So imagine you're a bunch of logistics professionals. You know, what if you knew that Maersk was going to be hit with devastating ransomware? You might make different logistics decisions like, well, they're going to be hit. Let's go ahead and use somebody else because we're going to be losing some money as a result. Maybe be willing to use different carriers. Maybe you would use a different approach. It's good to know. So what I'm doing is I'm showing that relationship between cybersecurity and logistics. So this is really critical. Maersk is going to be hit. You don't know. There's no such thing as 100% knowledge for what's actually going to be taking place, but this is a big consideration for sure. What if you knew that Maersk did not back up its Active Directory? To me, that's very concerning, especially given the background that I told you. I'm telling you a story so you understand the significance of these things. That's why I'm going through all of this. But what if you also knew that Maersk did not fully patch its systems, that they could have some piece of malware go through 55,000 systems in 7 minutes? That should frighten you. There's a lot of technical stuff for my more technical audiences that they could have used to protect themselves. But in this case, they didn't. And it's good to know this. For the technical audiences on the cybersecurity side of the house, this is part of third-party risk management or vendor risk management, depending on the terminology that you use. But we can collect some of this information to be able to give you an idea. Hey, what does this actually mean for the organization? You get a sense of that because then you get to say, hey, there are some real big warning signs that I'm seeing for what could possibly take place within Maersk. And I've done a lot of third-party risk assessments. I've also been on the receiving end of a lot of third-party risk assessments. Now, what happens is with a lot of these organizations, if they see anything that's concerning or, hey, Eternal Blue came out, they will contact you and say, are you patched? And then they go through and do that as part of their process. It can be quite painstaking to fill out the paperwork for all these different organizations that are asking you these basic questions. So again, this is very important. But my question is for anybody who's in the supply chain or logistics field, how would this affect your logistics? What if you knew all of these pieces of information? This is pretty key. So let's take a step forward in time a little bit. Now, some of you have seen this, and I have seen some information that this is slightly off. Let's call it roughly in the realm of 10% off. It depends on what source you're looking from, but I think that this is within 10% of the truth. So this particular crime report was put out in November 2022, but it's reasonably true. So in 2024, I haven't seen the numbers yet for 2024, but it's around 14.6 million, which is pretty severe. So if cybercrime itself were a country, it would be just behind the US and China. This is big news. Definitely big news and something to consider. So this means that crime is getting worse. So if you're sitting backwards from a cyber perspective, you're not doing things like even the basic IT hygiene, like patching a system, and there's a lot more I could go into with that. That's a big concern. So making sure that you're up to date with a lot of these things is absolutely critical. And there's a lot of things that we can do to begin to talk about that and understand what the repercussions are. But you can see where things are going because it's only going to get worse. A few years from now, we're going to be double. It's not unreasonable to make that assumption based on the data we've seen in the past and where we see things going. The reality is crime pays. And that's not something that we want to see. So at the time I put this presentation together, the 2025 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report was not out. I know that some of you may be thinking, well, isn't Verizon the phone company? Yes, but they do so much more. So I will admit, I'm a former Verizon employee. This information came out of the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, and they pull in more data from more sources around the globe to see exactly what's going on. So with the 2024 report, they were talking about 2023 data. But in there, they had, from a supply chain perspective, 260 incidents, 138 breaches. And so this graphic is pulling in supply chain data. So you can see here, there's a vulnerability that's exploited. So that eternal blue vulnerability is likely to be a problem. So patching is a big deal when you're talking about the supply chain. When you talk about backdoor, so let me explain a little bit what a backdoor is for the audiences who do not understand that. So a backdoor is something they put in so they can come back to the systems and get past all the firewalls and other things over and over and over again. Backdoors are extremely common, and they're definitely an issue when you're talking about proper cybersecurity hygiene. You need very good antivirus and a set of other controls, et cetera. There's extortion. We can go through all of these. Most of you can look at this and get the general idea of what the concerns are there, but definitely you can see that there's a lot of things going on when we're talking about supply chain breaches, but this is just a small facet of that. Okay, so what I want to do is take a look at a few sampling of incidents over 2024, just to give you an idea. In this case, UK Network Rail had terrorist messages on their Wi-Fi for weeks on end. They had trouble getting rid of it and getting them out of there. Transport for London, 5,000 customer details and a resetting of 30,000 passwords. Again, much smaller than something like Maersk, but you can see 30,000 passwords is a lot of work to do. I can't even imagine how their systems are set up, but definitely a concern. Port of Seattle had ransomware. You had JAS Worldwide offline for days because they were running into issues. Oahu Transit Services in the US, disrupted services. Radiant Logistics service disruptions. At the Beirut Rafik Al Hariri International Airport, compromised flight screens. Now, this is just a sample of stuff that's out there, but this does show that when you're talking about logistics, that there are real repercussions, and understanding the flow of the goods and or services that you're working with across the organization and how they interconnect and how you get those goods out there is incredibly important, because this can have real world impacts for your organization. So CrowdStrike, I think most of you at least have heard of it, even if you don't understand any of the details behind it. But here you're saying 60% of Fortune 100 companies were impacted. That's pretty severe. That doesn't mean that they had CrowdStrike, but they could have had other companies that were utilizing CrowdStrike affect their business. But you can see here, it is considered a very big deal what happened with CrowdStrike. Delta Airlines in this case was particularly hit hard. I don't know all the details behind it, but I do know that Delta is considering going after CrowdStrike, but a lot of the third-party services could have were using CrowdStrike, and that caused their systems to be down and caused a lot of damage to Delta Airlines. Now, the reality is for the companies that did okay, that had CrowdStrike, they would not do an automatic update to systems. You go through, and so what's standard, and I come from a federal background, so I've got a lot of experience. You go through and test things prior to putting it in production. But the reality is, if you would have tested it, you could have caught it and saved millions of dollars. That's true for a lot of different organizations. And so testing is one of those things. I've worked with a lot of different operational teams. Some are really big on it. No, we have to test everything. And I respect that. I think that is one of the best things that an operational team can do from an IT perspective. Test prior to implementation. And so those companies fared really well because they did not deal with the CrowdStrike issue. It did not have to deal with the repercussions of the CrowdStrike issue. There's the current supply chain. So let's take a look at it. So far, what I've been focusing on are things that are very easy to understand. Once I explain them to you, it makes perfect sense. So being easy to understand is part of what I've been doing, because I'm communicating largely with a logistics audience. But the world is much more complex than the current cases we've been focusing on. And we're going to expand our definition of that supply chain. So in the cyber realm, for those people who are listening from that perspective, you can see the deep, dark, and surface web. The surface web, this is like, hey, I'm going to Google to do a search. I'm going to Yahoo or whatever you're doing to buy goods and services online from the internet. But that's only 4% of what's going on. We're going to ignore the dark web. Yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff that's going on. But from a supply chain perspective, This is what matters because what happens is all these different websites, they're very much integrated to one another. That's where you have a lot of legitimate traffic. Much of it is the backbone of e-commerce because you buy something, say, with a credit card. That credit card is then going to go through a back end, they're going to connect into a major bank, make a purchase, then it comes back, and then it gets out there for the surface web. So there's a lot going on here. So when you're talking about the supply chain, this could be one part of the supply chain that you're starting to take a look at. You really need to pay attention to these kind of details because it can really affect things from a logistics standpoint. What if you couldn't connect into whatever vendor that's going on? So understanding that whole chain, that's why we call it a supply chain of what's going on from an electronic standpoint, can be just as important as what's going on from a logistics standpoint and the basic supply chain standpoint. So we do pay attention to these type of details. For companies that are very mature in their third-party processes, these are the types of things that we look for. We understand the interconnectivities to the best way we can in order to prevent damage to organizations. Third-party risk is one way that you can really help protect organizations. And I think I've made that point relatively clear right now. But here's the interconnected realities. There's a lot of cloud connected systems and they are connecting all over the place. So that's one part of it. In many cases, you're going to find what are called IoT connected systems. So that's Internet of Things. Now, there's lots of different versions of that. There's OT, there's SCADA. Those are basically for if you're doing mining or other all kinds of things you can get involved in with that. But also if they're dealing with different types of shipping things or automation that's going on within your warehouses, there are so many different options out there. There's also IOMT, Internet of Medical Things. That's a area that I have wrote a book on, so I've got a little bit of background on that. But the other thing too, there's a lot of AI going on. AI, I know it's like everybody needs to talk about AI these days, but the reality is a lot of the development backbone, when you're doing the development, you go get these free pieces of software off of the internet, you pull it in, and you have AI that's automatically built into it. And so when you're building and doing the development, because you want to save yourself time, you go get this free stuff and it's already got AI in there. You've got so much that's going on. Personal and corporate AI systems that are out there too. So I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms to get into, but you start to see the interconnection of companies is very complex. Also, you've got a lot of applications and other sorts of dependencies that are going on that'll connect in. So you can see that the internet is very complex. It's not something people think, oh, just go to the website. Like, yes, but there's a lot more that's going on behind the scenes. All right, cybersecurity hill. So we're going to change gears just a little bit today. I have been talking about things that are very easy to understand after I have taken the time to explain to you what the importance is. You know, some of you would have picked up on this, some would not. It depends on who you are and what your background is. But how do you assess the risk across potentially hundreds of data points to understand how it's going to impact your business? And that's exceptionally critical because a lot of orgs aren't really necessarily doing a good job at that. If you don't understand what's important, what isn't, it's hard to take a look at things from a business continuity perspective and figure out how are you going to handle things. So this is definitely a challenge when you're talking about logistics. You need somebody who is able to translate everything into a business risk so you understand what the potential impact is going to be. Some of that, the logistics people may or may not understand that depending on the type of organization and the maturity of the logistics program. So I do strongly recommend if you've got internal resources and you can develop this from a third-party perspective, build it. Go do that. It's fantastic. Whether you decide to work with a company like mine or you decide to work with something else, get a partner to help you. If you don't have people that can explain the intricacies and why these things are so valuable, that's what I can do. So cybersecurity and logistics, I do believe that we can create a strong partnership here. Both logistics and cybersecurity want to make the best decisions for the business. Cybersecurity is here to protect it. We're thinking about all things cyber, but we're also thinking about the business. In very good cybersecurity organizations, that's what's absolutely critical. But the reality is we do understand the business, but we also focused on risk management. You know, third-party risk management, TPRM, is the thing. Vendor risk management, some people prefer that term. We all are looking at the risks to the business as a result of things. But unless we're really tied into the business in a lot of different ways, that can bring up a lot of different challenges. So being able to communicate is exceptionally important. So my question is, what if you had a partner that helped your logistics teams understand the intricacies of the cybersecurity risk? How is that going to affect you? What are the important considerations if you've got these? How could it have saved you money in the long run had you understand what those risks are? How much could you save? Thank you so much.